Well, good afternoon, YouTube. This is Ariel, new DM Ariel, coming back to you here on the channel. Today is another beautiful Saturday afternoon. It's Independence Day weekend, so happy birthday, America, tomorrow. And I kind of liberated myself from my beard, so yeah, it's kind of hot right now, so probably the less body hair, easier to maintain. Although it's not, looking at the temperature at 92 Fahrenheit outdoors, which is still warm, but definitely about 10 degrees cooler than we had last week. So that's good if you like the cooler type weather or don't really like the extreme heat. But at any rate, today, I know I keep going back and forth before the between, I should say, the different editions. And last week we examined the fourth edition of D&D, and we're taking a look at what was being offered to players and to DMs, specifically in the in the Dungeon Master's guide for fourth edition, which is a pretty good tome, a pretty good core book, if you ask me. Even if you were not playing fourth edition, there's a lot of ideas that can be taken and gleaned from that and applied to other editions. Recently, I got a hold of this beauty in really good condition, which I did not own, which is the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition Player's Handbook, and I'm kind of perusing through some of the classes and some of the changes from back in the day, and it led me to look back at, I never really played 2nd Edition. I kind of had moved on or taken a break from the role-playing, the D&D hobby around the time that it came out. It was published first in around 1989, if I'm not mistaken. And so by that time, I had stopped playing regular campaigns. But I did take a look for comparison purposes at some of the classes in first edition to see how they change or compare to the second edition. And the answer is not that much, with some specific details, adding more details to some of the classes. And there are some changes that were could be considered significant. But for me, if I were to have create a character, I wanted to multi-class. Right now, I'm playing the 5th edition campaign, just started last week, and the 5th edition, I chose a Dwarf Cleric because I haven't really played the Clerics too much since recently, and I wanted to see how a 5th edition Cleric felt or played, and that led me to look at what the 2nd edition Cleric was like. And first edition didn't even specify Cleric, at least not in the player's handbook. They might have done it in other books. I haven't really looked at the other supplements of late, but I did look at the fighter, the first edition fighter, and how that differs from the second edition. And I also looked at the spellcasting classes for first and second edition, specifically the Cleric for second. The first edition player's handbook does not specify the Cleric. It just talks about magic users in general. And so, they don't even have wizards. They have magic users. And then they have the illusionist, which is like a specific set or a specific class of character that can cast spells. And so that's probably the closest we can compare it with, unless I'm mistaken. Other, I don't know, or Unearthed Arcana or some other tool may have gone into Clerics. I'll have to take a look later and see whether they how early they existed, or if they were even around or specified in first edition. So that's what I wanted to do today, is go back to second, since I'm very interested in looking at the old school RPGs, second edition, the different editions of the game, and kind of compare and contrast and see what they had to offer in terms of classes, specifically the fighter slash magic user slash cleric combination. And there was multitasking, multi-classing was specified. There were specific rules for multi-classing, but there were restrictions in second edition. So not every character type or every race could multi-class. Meaning, you can combine some attributes of one class and some attributes from the other class and just kind of combine them into one holistic, comprehensive character that takes advantage of both. You can't level them up at the same time, though, in second edition. You first level up one class up to a certain point, and then when you decide that you are going to start taking levels in the second class, then you don't forget the attributes of the first class, if I'm not mistaken, but you stop advancing and progressing in that level. And from that point on, you're just kind of working on your second class, and up to a specific level. But you do get the attributes or the skills from both classes, which is good. All right, so when we looked at second edition D&D classes, there was something called the class ability score requirements, and this existed in first edition. It got carried over into the second edition rule set, and basically what it was is, like it says here, each of the character classes had minimum scores in the various ability, and a character had to satisfy these minimum scores to be of that class. So you basically rolled your stats, and then you looked at with whatever method you used to create your stats, whether it be rolling them or using the alternate rules for that. And then you kind of compared and see which of the stats, which are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, which of the stats you wanted to put attributes in. But in order to be a specific class, you had to be a minimum. You had to meet certain requirements. For example, the first character class that we see in this table for the minimum class ability minimum is the fighter, and it lists the strength as the primary ability for the fighter. And this was the same for first and second edition. You had to have a minimum of 9. The difference is that I had a minimum of 9 in first edition and a constitution of 7. I think they did away with the constitution requirement in second edition, but you definitely had to still meet the strength requirement, because obviously if you're going to be a fighter, you have to have a minimum amount of strength. And if you have an exceptional amount, or something like I think it was like over 15. If you had a rating of over 15 in your strength attribute, in first edition, you would get a 10% experience bonus as a fighter. And the same was true for second edition. They carried that experience bonus into second edition, with the exception that they raised the strength attribute from 15 to 16. So if you have one more point, so if you had a 16, you have to be a 16 to get the experience bonus in second edition. So they made it a little bit, just slightly higher. And then if you look at the cleric here, there is a minimum requirement of wisdom, which you had to have a minimum requirement of a score of 9 on your wisdom attribute in order to become a cleric, And this was a little different from the first edition, because I mentioned that there were no clerics listed in the player's handbook for first edition that I'm aware of, and just magic users. And the magic users in first edition, it was not wisdom, but it was the intelligence attribute that they had to have, and the intelligence requirement had to be no less than 9, and they also required a minimum dexterity of 6. So the intelligence had to be no less than 9, and you had to have a 6 or above dexterity attribute in order to be a magic user. And in order to get the 10% experience bonus, your intelligence had to be over 16. So definitely above average intelligence was required to be a magic user, which makes sense. I mean, you're learning and applying the practical knowledge to your spellcasting. So that was the thinking there with the character attributes. Another thing that was slightly different going from first to first edition to second edition is that at the 9th level, when a fighter reached a 9th level, they went by titles. So the title for the 9th level was a lord. So then you become a lord as a fighter once you reach the 9th level, and you can establish a freehold. Like you get some land and you set up like a castle or something, and that's your property. And once you have your freeholder, your castle established, then you could attract a small army or a small band of men at arms that will fight for you, which is nice. This was a concept I really liked, and I don't know if that. I don't think it currently. I could be wrong. I have to do more research, but I don't think it applies to the more modern editions of Dungeons and Dragons, third edition, 3.5, fourth, and above. I know that you have minions for the monsters in fourth edition, and I know, and different types of level categories, but I'm not sure if you have followers, or rather if you have like men at arms or people that will fight for you, or like small band of dedicated followers as a fighter in later editions, like they did back in first and second edition of the game. Also, they might have done away with that. I'm not sure. I'll have to check. So don't take me at my word. But that was definitely a thing back in first and second edition for the character classes and for the class of a fighter. Let's see. Going to take a quick look at the fighter, which is on page 26 of the second edition handbook, if you have a copy of this old book and you're following along. So we talked about the requirements. Also, the experience levels. You basically had to get 2,000 experience points just to get to second level, and then the different experiences were not uniform. I think in later editions also of D&D, they've tried to standardize. I know fourth edition for sure that they standardized the level range, the level tiers, or the wording of levels, so you can level progression. And in later editions, like fourth edition, is basically like a tiered system where you, and I've talked about this before, but you have a tier system where you have from X amount of level, like level 1, 0, or whatever the starting level is, all the way up to 20 or 24, whatever it was. Then you're called like a hero, or it's a heroic tier, and then there's the epic tier, and they have different categories. But in the earlier edition of the game of Dungeons and Dragons, it went pretty much by your class. So if you were a fighter, for example, you needed 2,000 experience points to reach second level. If you were a paladin, which is a subset of fighters, or a ranger, you needed 2,250 experience points to get to that same plateau or that same level. Also, in terms of the fighters, another thing that was kind of cool about the second edition fighters with their followers is that you could roll a percentile dice on a table once you reach a specific level, and you try to get different types of leaders of your troops, or different types of followers. For example, you roll the suggested percentile dice after a fifth level, at a specific level, and then you could get a different kind of follower called a leader, which was like a fifth level fighter, and they're possessed the plate mail, a shield, and a battle axe, which gave them a +2 on their weapon. And then depending on your role, that would give you whatever, that would tell you what type of follower you had. So it's kind of random on that, but it was kind of nice because you would get different type of fighters to go fight with you, and different type of troops. And they also had this thing called elite units, where you could get, like, for example, like mounted knights on a horse mounted knights. You could get wardens, you can get berserkers. So you get a different type of character follower to fight with you in your adventures, depending on what you got on your specific role. So that was kind of unique. I don't know if followers are a thing. I suspect that henchmen and followers might have continued into 3.5, because I do play, or have played Dungeons and Dragons online, and I know that one of the features that I like about that online game is that you can basically buy a henchman, with game money, and you could have like if you want a cleric to follow you into the dungeons, then you can buy a cleric, or a contract. They call it a contract for a cleric, and so a cleric will fight for you in the instance or the specific dungeon that you're in the game. So I suspect that they either got that game mechanic from AD&D, first and second edition, or they carried it over into 3.5 in the tabletop game, and they just added it to the online game. Not sure, gonna have to check on that as well. But that is basically how the fighter levels progression worked in the in second edition, which was a little bit different. In first edition, you got to be a lord at 9th level, and you could establish your castle, and then you would attract your men at arms. It took 250,001 experience points just to get to attain the attain the next level, and you gained 3 hit points per level after the 9th level, which was kind of nice. And then in terms of the cleric, well, let's take a quick look at the cleric, the magic user, or the spellcasting cleric class in second edition. This is a combination that I wanted to play with a fighter / cleric, and you can do second edition. You can multi-class, like I mentioned. So the cleric is in a subset of a class called the priest. So basically, all clerics are priests, but not all priests are clerics. But the cleric is described in page 33 of the handbook. Let me turn to that to refresh my memory. So the basic ability requirement, as I mentioned, for magic user in first edition was a level 9 on intelligence, but the cleric in second edition is a wisdom attribute that they have the requirement of 9. And the way that the spell progression, the way that the level progression worked is they started at level 1 as a cleric. You get 0 experience points, but then once you reach 1,500 experience points, then you get to second level, and then you need to get to 3,000 to get to third level, and so on. So you go up every 1,500 XP or so, and then your hit dice go up too. At first level, you got a D8, 1D8. Second level, you got 2D8, 3D8, and so forth. But what's also great about the cleric class is you had to have a minimum score of 9, but you also were suggested to have a high constitution, although it wasn't required, but it was suggested. And charisma also were useful because, for obvious reason, you're casting spells and you're dealing with PCs at a high level. Also, a cleric who had the wisdom of 16 or more gained a 10% bonus to the experience points that he earned. So this experience percentage added bonus to experience is not something I think that got carried over. I could be wrong again. I have to check, but I don't think it was carried over. Definitely, I don't think it's on 5th edition. And the priest or the cleric's spell progression is basically that of a priest, where you get at first level you have one first level spell, and that's it. They were very limited. Second level you got your 2 spells, and it wasn't really until like 7th or 8th level that you get multiple. Well, I guess 6th level you got 3 first. You got about 3, 6, 8 spells, versus like only 5 at 4th level. So definitely you want the higher level you are, the more access you have to a variety of spells. But there are some spells that were only usable by clerics with 17 or greater wisdom. Some of the spells were completely off limit if they did not meet this high wisdom requirement. And they were only usable by them too with 18 or greater wisdom. So there are some spells that are off limits to your character if you don't even meet this attribute minimum requirement, which is kind of different now. Today they don't have as many restrictions on the different type of classes. All right, guys, I have to make a small correction. I did pause for a second, and I took a look at the first edition. I was taking a look at the first edition player's handbook, and there was indeed a cleric class. So we did have clerics in first edition, and the attributes are pretty much the same as in second. Wisdom was the main ability score required, which means you had to have a minimum score of 9. But and if you had the 15 as in your wisdom, then if you had that higher rating, then you could add the 10% experience point that we talked about. So they didn't change that in second edition, just carried over to the second edition clerics, and experience points were awarded the same way from zero to 1500. You needed to reach basically 1500 exp to get the first level, and then you could gain the title Acolyte. They went by titles. So at second level, you were known as an adept, and by third level, you were a priest. And so it wasn't until the higher levels, when you were a high priest, that you could, gain a lot more hit points. The hit points went up every level. So first level, you had 1, 2, second level, 3 hit point, 3. You basically rolled 8-sided dice for accumulated hit points. So that was they were indeed clerics were a thing, but I'm not here to take a look primarily at first edition. I'm here to take a look primarily at second edition clerics, and the second edition clerics, which were subclasses of the priest. Like I said, had all those level requirements, and one thing that that they did have is they had their the different types of spells. Most of their spells were like healing. They had a lot of, obviously the cleric has always been thought about as a healer primarily, so you had a lot of healing spells to be sure. But they also a lot of their spell choices or the spells that they could use per level were dependent on their deity, because the clerics are worshiping a specific god or a specific deity, and depending on the deity that they chose. For example, there was the agriculture, or you could follow a deity of nature or thunder or war. In the 5th edition, they kind of carried this idea into the later editions. And in 5th edition, I chose a dwarf cleric that was devoted to the god of war, and so you would have some proficiency in using the battle axe, or some bonus to your proficiency to battle axe, axes, spears, or even a sword, if you were in that specific mythology, or following that type of deity. So that was something that was a thing in second edition. And then another thing that so one of the attributes, or one of the specific features of the cleric class is healing powers. And then another thing that I really neglected to speak about so far was that the cleric is also granted power over the undead. Very important when you come up to against evil creatures that exist in a form of non-life, either dead or not alive. So the cleric is charged with defeating these types of mockers of life, the book says. So the ability to turn undead has always been, even dating back to like the basic form of the game. That's one of the primary features of the cleric, that they're able to turn the undead, such as dead creatures like ghosts and zombies, skeletons, ghouls, mummies, and some of the more powerful ones like vampires and liches. A lich is an undead sorcerer, for those of you that are not familiar with fantasy tropes. So those are some of those powerful undead creatures, and the clerics have dominion over, are able to cast spells to have dominion over those type of enemies. And it's all contingent upon the type of deity or the type of mythology that they follow. So in second edition, the level progression is different. The minimum requires are different, because you have to have a specific set of requirements to actually play the type of character, to be that class. And also the spell progression is different, because the clerics go up on their spells. Like they talked about this already, so at level 5 they would have 8 spells. At level 16, they get a ton of spells. So it really depends. The higher you go, obviously, the more access to these type of cleric type cleric specific spells that you're gonna have. Okay, guys, the last thing I'm going to touch upon really quickly is the multi-class and dual-class character game mechanics of second edition. I'm going to go really quickly on this because this video is getting longer than I expected already. But essentially, you can multi-class and have dual-class in second edition. There's a difference. Multi-class refers to the combinations of the character races. And the book says that all of the standard demi-human races are listed along with the multi-class combinations that they can have. And by demi-human races, they mean class. That's another name, another way of saying not human, like a dwarf or like an elf or a half-elf. So basically, the class combination that I was looking to multi-class was a fighter cleric. I am multi-classing that in 5th edition, but in 2nd edition, in order to play a fighter cleric, you can only be a dwarf. And in order to play a fighter thief, for example, you can only be a dwarf to use that combination. And in order to play a fighter / thief, you could be a halfling. So actually, fighter thief is you could be a dwarf, a halfling, or an elf. And fighter cleric, you have to be a dwarf or a gnome. So what I'm getting at is the different class combinations have requirements of the different race that you can be. Humans are not eligible for multi-class, but they can dual class. So they get all the dual class benefits and restrictions. So to be dual class, that means that the character has to have scores of 15 or more in the prime requisite of his first class, and then a score of 17 or greater in the prime requisite of another class he switches to. So the character selects one class to begin his adventuring life, and then he can advance in this class as many levels as he or she desires before they switch to another class. There's no actual cutoff point for them to do this, beyond which the character cannot switch. However, they have to attain at least 2nd level in the current class before changing to another class. So once they get to 2nd level in the first class, then they can dual class and pick up another class, essentially, so they can have the characteristics and the skills of both classes. So, which is pretty cool, and only humans apparently could do this in 2nd edition. I don't know if the later editions of the game did away with this race requirement, but it's definitely a thing back in 2nd edition. So that's just a game mechanic to be aware of when you're running a 2nd edition D&D campaign. So that's all I have for today. You guys have a great weekend. Enjoy the 4th of July and be safe. And if you like this video and want more type of D&D related content about the different edition wars or edition characteristics, what's different, compare and contrast the different editions of Dungeons & Dragons, then go ahead and like this video and or subscribe, or you can do both. And thank you so much for watching.